Welcome to the latest in our series of TopMedTalks 2. In these podcasts, the TopMedTalk team is in conversation with global thought leaders in perioperative care. TopMedTalk. I have called a special guest, Professor John Myburgh, who's in Sydney in Australia. John has been a stalwart of the great world fluid debate held at the annual meeting, the EBPOM meeting in London each year, and John's been coming to us for a number of years now. And as a result of that, possibly, he's conducted some of the largest trials in the world trying to resolve the great world fluid debate. So John, how are you?
Very well, Monty. And may I say that I was gutted not to be there at EBPOM, my first miss in the other 10 years. And I followed the conference online and looked, as usual, as an exit meeting.
Excellent. Thank you, John. John, not everyone will know you as well as I know you. Can you just tell us a little bit about yourself and your current roles?
Thanks, Monty. Well, I'm an intensive care physician. Worked in Australia for, in ICU for over 35 years, originally trained in South Africa, but working in a major adult mixed ICU for that period of time. But I guess my expert clinical work has been involved in high-level research, but in this space, already conducting high-grade clinical trials, mainly comparative effectiveness trials, looking at standard interventions and working out the efficacy and safety of what we do every day. The launch pad of these big trials we did, of course, was a SAFE study, and that was when our relationship really began, presenting the outcome of the 7,000 patient Saline versus fluid evaluation, which was conducted in response to the Cochrane analysis that Ian Roberts published in the BMJ in 1999. And from that SAFE study, we then conducted a whole series of other fluid trials, looking at various fluid types, hydroxyethyl starch and saline. And we're currently running the trilogy, which is the PLUS study, which is a plasmolite versus saline study. And that's been my fluid research activities over the last 15 years.
And that puts almost everyone else's efforts into a dark in the shadows. That's an incredible effort there, John. So John, what do you think, just a headline summary, is the takeaway from your previous trials? We'll come back to the current trial in a moment, but what do you think are the big takeaways from the previous one? What do we know about albumin in the context of the critically ill now?
Well, I think the important thing is when you interpret these large comparative effectiveness trials, people often misinterpret or perhaps misrepresent what these trials were about. I mean, these trials were designed to answer one question.
Yes.
Designed primarily to address safety and efficacy of one fluid versus the other. Because in both the albumin trials and the starch trials, there were very real questions raised about the safety and efficacy of albumin.
Yes.
Posed by Cochrane.
And quite serious. They suggest that it was really quite dangerous. I mean, almost toxic.
Yeah. Well, the meta-analysis that Ian Roberts published a long time ago, and that was done the last century, and perhaps not conducted the same level of rigor that we would do on nowadays. But the important thing about that meta-analysis was that it posed a question that albumin was associated with a 6% increase in death in patients. And that's a very big effect size, and we used Cochrane's study, the Cochrane study, to power our trial to do a study looking at half the effect size of 3%. And that was informed by the Cochrane analysis, and that's why we did a 7,000 patient trial. And we basically answered the question that albumin and saline did not increase mortality in a large population of ICU patients. And that was the point of SAFE. You obviously get insights into mechanisms and into patient subgroups, which is a good thing of these trials, but those are always hypothesis generating. So what we found was that there was no difference in mortality between albumin and saline. That can be interpreted that it's safe to use, or that saline is equi-effective.
Yes.
It doesn't necessarily say that one's better than the other.
Yes.
But it informed the clinical question. But I think the key thing about SAFE was that for the first time, in the context of a blinded, randomized, controlled, pragmatic study conducted in real-life conditions, began to question a lot of the benefits that we thought were attributable to colloids.
Yes.
Specifically, the crystalloid sparing effect of colloids.
Yep.
The old 3-to-1 ratio clearly is not true. And this has now come out with a number of trials and in different settings. And the equi-effective crystalloid colloid ratio for commonly used hemodynamic endpoints is about 1.4 to 1.
Yes.
So these solutions don't really provide a lot of sparing. And in parallel, we've had tremendous insights into the glycocalyx and the impact of those mechanistic issues. And these observations accord with understandings in that. And that, I think, is probably the biggest contribution of the big colloid trials to our current practice.
It was raised in the Great World Fluid debate this year briefly. I know you have to be careful with subsets, but there was a signal of possible harm in the trauma subset. And is that enough to say if there's a signal of harm, you should stay away from using such fluids?
The subset was particular to traumatic brain injury.
Yes.
That was an important subset because the SAFE study was stratified by doses of trauma to make sure that we're equal balance.
Yes.
And that was an important consideration in interpreting that subgroup. So we had 3,500 patients in each group, and that was stratified for doses of trauma because there was uncertainty.
Yes.
And the overall mortality from trauma was very low, as you would expect. The main driver of death in that group of patients was due to TBI, traumatic brain injury.
Yes.
We then saw a striking difference in mortality in patients who received albumin compared to saline.
Yeah.
And that effect size was quite large, and we drilled down in that in a post-hoc analysis, and we acknowledged up front this was not powered for this, and looked at it very carefully because of the concerns we had. And in fact, we showed in some quite sophisticated modelling that this was attributable to increase in ICP used with albumin. What's become sort of not that clear is whether that was attributable to albumin per se, or whether it was due to the hypotonic concentration of albumin that we used.
Yes.
And my view is that it's probably a mixture of both. But the effect size that we observed in a very large subset was enough to advise caution in these patients. But in fact, it may well be that the extravasation of albumin or colloids into the brain tissue may in fact be harmful. And I guess I would love to do a trial like that to answer the question, but there would be very serious ethical concerns about getting consent for this.
Yes. And John, with albumin, we often don't know the electrolyte, unless it's different with you, we often don't know the electrolyte composition or we don't concentrate on the electrolyte composition of the crystalloid component of the colloid. Insofar
that the solution that we used was 4% albumin and normal saline.
So 154 of sodium and 154 of chloride, because that's not always what we get here when we look at it more closely. Or is that what you had at your end?
No, that's correct. But the carrier fluid is saline.
Okay.
And you're right, the concentration may be an important issue as well. Lab evidence to date would suggest that saline is the fluid of choice for traumatic brain injury.
Yep.
But we talked later about the saline versus balanced salt solution trials. We can perhaps address that further on in terms of whether or not that is actually true.
Yes. So then, if we just, before we get to that one, jump very briefly to chest, because we've spoken about this a lot in the past. Yeah. Some very important messages from that. So your headline, again, of what you think chest told us, in the context of the other trials that went on around the time.
Yeah. Well, the hydroxyethyl starch story has been fascinating. It's been going on for over 10 years now, and it's generated a lot of publicity and press and partisan views and reactions from industry and reactions from medical regulatory authorities. It is a tremendous story, and there's no doubt that your meeting was a very important vehicle to express those opinions, and that's an important contribution. Bottom line is, I think there's now compelling evidence that the use of synthetic colloids, particularly hydroxyethyl starch, for the simple reason that this is the preparation that's been studied the most, is associated with adverse patient-centered outcomes with no significant benefit at all. And that alone, in my view, is enough to seriously question their use in current clinical practice. They cause adverse effect or harm, particularly kidney injury, which the debate has been long and hard about that, how you quantify that. But our view is that if you're going to measure this, it has to be patient-centered. And the only one that is important, really, is the use of renal plasma therapy and not surrogate scoring systems. And again, the chest study in particular was an important contribution to that debate, even though the debate got quite heated. The use of scoring systems to quantify renal injury, and this is germane to the SMART studies as well, is not, in my view, a patient-centered outcome.
Right.
That has to relate to how the patient feels, functions, and survives. And the requirement for dialysis, in my view, is the key metric. And I think that is the key outcome from CHEST, and in fact with the success studies, that exposing people to starch, for which there is a strong biological mechanistic process, expose them to increased risk of the need for dialysis. And in my view, that is a very serious consideration why you should not give patients these products. I have the same view of the gelatin, purely on a extrapolation basis, and I acknowledge that there is no equivalent trial.
Yeah.
But the biological processes by which you are infusing foreign substances produced, from gelatins and from potatoes and from maize in crystalloid vectors, which accumulate in tissues, cannot be physiologically defended, in my view.
So, John, what did the long-term follow-up show? Because we're discussing at the moment the RELIEF trial, the restrictive versus liberal, led by Paul Miles trial. And again, one of the primary outcome variables that was different in the two groups there was so-called AKI, but included in that was statistically significant difference in the use of renal replacement therapy in the patients in the restricted, which was more of a zero balance group. Now they're proposing to do a long-term follow-up with Ronaldo Blomo, who you know very well, etc. I think that's what Paul, etc., are trying to see if they can get funded at the moment. What did you find in CHEST? And long-term follow-ups in critical care patients, we know, is extremely difficult to separate the signals.
Yes. So the CHEST long-term follow-up was pre-specified. It was done not dissimilar to what Andy Shaw's group did, Vanderbilt, using registered data. We had 6 months, which we had measured with direct assessments, looking at tools, and then looked at mortality at 24 months.
Yes.
Taking those in sequence, we did a quality of life, just life years using the different tools we used.
Yep.
And we saw no difference between the starch group and the saline group. And that was the best metric that we had to do that. Similarly, there was no difference in mortality at 2 years between the two groups, which isn't surprising, given that there wasn't more difference in mortality at 3 months. So that didn't really surprise us. The main objective for that study was twofold. First was to test the robustness of the outcome metric using qualities and life years gained. And remember that a bit like the renal story, these metrics aren't specifically designed to quantify long-term outcomes in ICU patients. A very prominent journal that we both know is very reluctant to publish these kind of analyses on the grounds that the metrics that we use to quantify this are not that robust.
Yes.
These studies will inform better metrics and pre-plan to how we can really assess long-term outcomes that are patient-centered, which go beyond the EQ5 D301s. So I'm not criticizing my own trial. We did the best outcome measures we had available. Results reported as they stand. The second thing which goes in with that is health economics, because on the one hand you have to have patient-centered outcomes, and the second one is health economics. And we showed, not surprisingly, that there were greater costs incurred with patients who received starch compared to saline. And these are mainly due to increased costs in the ICU, which again concurs with what the trial showed. And I think those are the important contributions of this long-term outcome study that published in The Lancet, which adds to the debate. And certainly the trials that we're doing now, looking at long-term follow-ups, will focus on probably more robust outcome metrics that we can measure at different intervals, and looking at better costings for patients, looking at micro costings and basically healthcare costings. So whilst there's this big push to do these long-term outcome studies, and they're very, very, very important, the key focus, in my view, is to remember that anything you're measuring has to be an assessment that is robust of how the patient feels, functions, and survives.
Yes.
And the current metrics that we have at this point in time, I would submit, don't really reflect that. So the best we've got. And I've discussed this with people, and we need to take the lessons learned from these trials, like CHEST and those ones, and then perhaps make these outcome measures more robust and more applicable to our patients.
What?
And in parallel with that is matching that to what it costs the community. And I guess one of the final comments I make about that is that looking at costing studies and outcome studies, these have to be interpreted within the context in which these trials were conducted. In Australia, where you have universal healthcare, as you do in the United Kingdom, there are some comparisons there, but the comparison is coming out of the United States, for example, or perhaps Eastern Europe, or in places which is user pays, those costings are quite different. And that generalizability needs to be considered very carefully.
So one of the points raised with Paul Miles about his trial is if there's a difference in short-term outcomes, like the use of hemofiltration, acute kidney injury, infections, but there's no difference in, and he chose disability-free 1 year survival. Yep. The short-term outcome is, I don't believe this, the short-term outcome is a bit of a ho-hum finding. It doesn't really inform us when we're trying to make big decisions. Now, I believe the short-term outcomes do relate to long-term outcomes, but it takes a long time for them to come to fruition. And as you say, we need very robust, validated measures to be able to detect that signal. So what do you say to those people who say, well, so what, that there was a transient difference in the use of hemofiltration because it didn't translate into any meaningful long-term outcome? Do you all say it's the robustness of the measure?
Well, that's a very important comment, Monty, and as usual, I would agree with you on that point. Again, it comes down to the robustness of the metrics. I think one of the biggest contributions to the literature in that context was the long-term follow-up that we did of the renal study.
Yes.
Now, the renal study, as you recall, was a large trial comparing different doses of hemodiafiltration in pretty sick patients. The mortality rate in that group was over 40%.
Yes.
And we compared 25 mils per kilo per hour versus 40 mils per kilo per hour, and the outcome measure was day 90, and there was no difference, which would suggest that a low intensity dialysis mode done in Australia, which is a different practice to the US perhaps, didn't improve outcome, and therefore a more cost-effective way to do that. The important thing about that study was we did a long-term follow-up, 4 years, in the survivors. And I think that the renal study told us two things. The first thing is that the mortality rate in patients who require dialysis is higher than patients who don't.
Yes.
It's a really major insult to patients. And secondly, patients who survive that incur long-term renal damage.
Yes.
Which persists for a long time. There is objective measurements of renal injury, albuminuria. There's an increased incidence in use of chronic dialysis and a much higher mortality rate, which presents later in life. Now, this is specific to a patient population of critically ill.
Yes.
There are clearly pre-morbid factors at play here. There may be the additional burden of the insult that occurred and some of the treatments.
Yes.
And I think that's the kind of population where this insult would be exposed. In these surgical patients, which in Paul's excellent study, these are patients undergoing major surgery.
Yep.
The event rate for renal failure mortality was very low.
Yes.
Which is why they chose to use their composite endpoint measure.
Yep.
And I think that a signal which shows a transient or short-term increase in renal patient therapy, which is potentially avoidable, is a really important signal.
Yeah.
But the question is this: if you're going to consent the patient to a procedure,
yes,
you need to disclose them. Now, you expose them to a high risk of requiring one of the most burdensome interventions in practice, which is potentially avoidable. It's a bit like giving patients starch.
Yes.
I wouldn't expose a patient to get a bag of starch with the smallest increased risk of requiring dialysis.
Yeah.
And the same thing applies here. You've got to be careful. And, what concerns me about the relief trial is how this trial is interpreted and then promoted or discussed. It doesn't mean to say that you can now give lots more Fluid to patients.
Yes.
Because, there's a lower rate. It's very carefully done. It's personalised medicine. It's done with less fluid. The volumes are much lower than beforehand.
Yeah.
But giving a super restrictive approach may in fact not be the way we thought it was. And the relief trial is a very important contribution to literature in terms of how we carefully use this. There's no doubt in my view that this trial, a bit like the classic trial that Peter Horchip published, the pilot trial, used to question how we give fluids. And fluids need to be done very carefully on a personalised basis, integrating all the results of all the major comparative effectiveness trials and the process of care trials, such as Paul's trial in specific patient population.
Sorry, John, I get the impression that you, as I do, think that Paul's proposal with Ronaldo, Baloma, etc., to do a long-term follow-on on these patients would be a significant contribution to our understanding of the meaning of these shorter-term signals.
Yeah, I would, but I think to increase the return on the buck would be to identify patients who are at higher risk.
Okay, gotcha.
The ones who have pre-existing renal dysfunction, patients who perhaps have major blood loss. I'm just speaking off the cuff here. Septic patients, emergency surgery, age patients, because there's no doubt that there are patients who are at higher risk and in whom a difference could be determined.
So just a couple more questions from me, John. You've been very generous with your time. You mentioned your ethical concerns of exposing patients to hydroxyethyl starch during elective surgery, for example. Now, in our colloid crystalloid discussion, where in the follow-up we asked Mark Edwards, who was on the panel, who's one of our national clinical trialists, and Paul Miles, who we've just been discussing, Tim Miller asked them both if they thought, in the context of elective surgery, if the colloid crystalloid question was still alive, and you can listen to it online, they thought very much it is, and the trials need to be done. Now, if the trials were to be done, I'm guessing that you'd need to ask the question about albumin, you'd need to ask the question about starches, you'd need to ask the question about gelatins. Now, gelatins have never been approved in the USA for concerns about the safety of using them, as I understand. Starches, you've just expressed the concerns that are there about starches, and albumin might make a tight brain tighter, and if you're doing, for example, long-term, in other words, lengthy laparoscopic head-down tilt surgeries, robotic surgeries, we know the brain gets swollen. So we can all construct paradigms whereby we'd have significant concerns about each of those fluids. So, A, do you think it's an important question, as they believe, in the context of elective surgery to be checked off? And B, do you think it would be ethical to do them?
I mean, obviously very important questions. I mean, I'll take a reductionist view. I would have grave concerns in doing a synthetic colloid trial in those patients. I think there's enough evidence now to really question the ethics of doing a starch versus saline or plasma-like solution in any patient group. I think you're exposing patients to unnecessary risk.
Okay.
And if you do that, you'll need to disclose that quite clearly to patients.
Yep.
And this has been the subject of deliberations with the various medical regulatory authorities. The drug manufacturers have been charged with producing trials. To answer this question, I've seen that through these trials, they are not close to getting to answer this question in terms of the design. And I just think that there's enough evidence, in my view, to really question the ethics of that. And I certainly would have grave concerns about putting patient of mine into that kind of trial.
So
that's my view, and I know...
Yeah, I can sympathise with the regulators here, though, John, because if the trials have never been done to answer the question, and we want the evidence to know if they're safe, but you don't think it's ethical to do the trials, that does seem like catch-22 to me.
It is, but the point is that the reason why we did those trials in this ICU context is because you expose the sickest patients to the intervention.
Sure.
And there is a dose response there. There's a dose response there. Anders Perner's trial, and people always talk about the old starch trial saying it was unethical, it had too much fluid, out of context, but that was standard practice at the time.
Sure.
And we've now got quite a nice dose response, relationship between giving these fluids to patients, and I just can't see how, a general population of ICU patients or patients septic shock exposed to stuff can somehow be different to patients who have had elective surgery.
Okay, so
particularly given the insight.
Yeah. We'll loop back on that in a second, John, because I've said before that I'm not convinced that doing saline interventional trials is ethical because there's enough signals there to suggest harm. But so let's tuck the starch away for a second. What do you do about the albumin and the gelatin? Because there is. There is concerns about albumin. There are concerns. There's concerns about everything. We have to be honest. They're all drugs, and there are definite concerns about gelatins. Do you think we should do one of those trials, or both those together in some sort of factorial design?
They're quite different. I mean, take gelatins first. Again, I accept without any reservations that the trials haven't been done in gelatin.
Yeah.
The evidence is pretty thin. The most of it is pre and post studies, and all the trials that bedeviled the starch industry beforehand are protagonist-driven. And you can get any result you want. I just find, on a mechanistic basis, that a synthetic foreign substance, which doesn't necessarily produce the purported colloidal beneficial effects, is a good idea.
What about albumin? What about albumin? Albumin's very expensive and still used in bucket loads.
Yeah, I would certainly have the same concerns about gelatin, but I accept the evidence is in there to justify that statement.
Okay.
And I think ethically you could get it passed. With regards to albumin, different story as well, because of the logistics, the purities, the expense, the cost. But I would say that's something worth considering. I would model it on a similar sort of comparative effectiveness strategy. It needs to be pragmatic, it needs to be real life. And I think there's a case for that. I just think that, again, I would ask people to carefully think about it in terms of what outcomes do you use to quantify the effect. As it's patient-centered, you need to have a big enough trial to look at a reasonable effect size. And I think it'll be a difficult trial to do because the event rates you're talking about in these patients is very low. With regards to your extrapolation of the paradigm of patients being tilted down and getting brain swelling from that, I think that's a very long bow.
Yeah.
And I don't think that there's enough evidence to restrict the albumin in those patients. I think it comes down to a loss of brain barrier integrity, stabilization of albumin in high doses. I think that's a very different context in TBI is the surgery. So I think if you wanted to do that in those patients, you could consider it.
And the penultimate bit before we get to the saline versus balanced solutions, plasma like Hartmann's, etc., and it overlaps with that. Do you think you could answer or try and get a bigger clue about if there is true advantages, both efficacy, safety, etc., with albumin by doing a similar trial, in other words, a cluster, an in-house cluster randomised trial that they did in Vanderbilt to try and answer the albumin crystalloid question? Would that be is that be a cost-effective way of doing it?
I think it would. Actually, the Vanderbilt trial was an outstanding trial. It was very, very good, very well done. And I think that would be a very effective way of doing that in that context, in a cluster study with perhaps an adaptive design. I think that kind of thing would be feasible in that context. I think that in that context, I think that would be a much more feasible way of answering the question. And perhaps even doing, if you want to be even more adventurous, some kind of adaptive design or some kind of factorial design, incorporating restrictive and liberal strategies. That would be a very powerful trial to answer that question. So I think the parallel group, big studies like we did in SAFE, I think is useful for one context. But if I was to design an albumin versus saline or crystalloid study in surgical patients, I think a cluster study like that with some kind of adaptive or factorial element would be interesting.
And I can see the sense in going as albumin as the so-called gold standard colloid, because it's certainly in our country it's wildly expensive. It's 100 times more expensive than crystalloid. So
that's a key question, Monty. Yeah. It's a key question, and if you don't see any difference, and within terms of restrictive or liberal strategies which have been now validated or tested in the relief trial, you then ask the question. I mean, if you aren't producing the definable patient outcomes or benefits, then your question is sort of answered.
Yes. So the last thing, John, what did you... I know you wrote the editorial related to it, but for those people who haven't necessarily had time to read the editorial yet, shame on them, the Vanderbilt trials, these large in-house cluster randomised trials comparing saline to balanced electrolyte solutions, what did you make of them? You've referred to the fact that they're cool designs, which we all agree with, but what do you think they give us an answer?
Yeah, I think they were very, very important trials. I mean, I've known Andy Shaw for many years. He's apart from being a really nice bloke, their group have done some really important work over the years, using their databases and observational trials, pre and post and associations, and they've taken it to the next level. And I thought the SMART and SALTER trials were very, very well designed studies. What I really liked about those trials was the validity of the design, the integrity of their processes, the transparency of the reporting, and the honesty of their interpretation. I thought it was an excellent initiative by some very, very good people. And that should be recognized. I mean, you see so much stuff that's done without those parameters of integrity, honesty, transparency,
yes,
with optimization and changing of those things. And I think the SMART these two trials were outstanding in that point of view.
Yes.
Yeah. The issue with them, of course, comes down to the very, very important issues of, first of all, the outcome measures, which were in the SMART trial, which was basically the composite endpoint,
yes,
which they make 31. They quite strongly assert it's patient-centered, and I disagree with that somewhat, because the major driver of that process, in fact, was mortality and creatinine levels. And the major driver of the difference, in fact, was the creatinine level differences. I think that was a pragmatic outcome measure that they chose for their trial design, and the signal was important. Secondly, the trial was unblinded, and I think that does raise questions of ascertainment bias. And that's not a criticism of the investigators or the trial design. It's pragmatic, but there's no doubt that does cause an issue, even though you've got a very powerful trial. And the third thing was done within the context of one major US centre,
yes,
where we basically had two big ICUs. That model is very different to the rest of the world. Now, I hate criticising trials to be negative. I think the trial is excellent. The effect size in what we saw were impressive.
Yes.
There's no doubt about that. And in fact, it does now raise questions about whether or not the use of saline in these patients is safe and effective. We're running the PLUS study now in Australia, and the Brazilians are running the basic study in Brazil, and we're going well with these trials.
Yes.
And we sat down with our groups, asked the question, should we continue our trials in the event of the publication of these two very important trials? We've discussed it long and hard, and we've come to the conclusion that more information is necessary to answer whether or not this is a true thing. I have no doubt that the PLUS study in Australia and New Zealand and the Brazil study will add to the power, the signal. In a couple of years' time, we'll have a definitive answer. The SMART studies, particularly in the ICU patients, the ED study was less robust for a variety of reasons, coming down to how these patients were defined. But I think this important trial needs to heighten the acuity of clinicians to ask the question. And it does need to, you have to ask the question whether or not exposing patients to large volumes of saline who may be at risk of renal failure should be done.
In my interview, which you can listen to online with Andy, and I was hoping to triangulate this, and we'll try and do that at a later stage with and maybe a larger group than just a triangle. I'm provocatively, like you say, with regards to giving people hydroxyethyl starch, have for a number of years said, well, what do you do when you go to consent the patient about putting them in the saline arm? Because you have to turn around and say, no one's demonstrated that this is more effective. No one's demonstrated that this is safer. There are concerns that it may hurt your kidneys and may increase your chance of dying. So why do you want me to be in this limb? Where's the gain? Where's the hypothesized benefit of the saline? I know people say, well, it's the most commonly used solution. That to me is not an excuse.
I agree. I agree, and I think that up until the publication of the SMART studies or Andy studies or Vanderbilt studies, that question was totally unknown. I thought some of the almost evangelical comments about against saline were overstated.
Yes,
they were based on small studies, animal studies, pre and post studies, observational trials, and I thought that the reaction people was overstated. I hear their concerns, and I thought, well, answer is to do a trial. The interesting thing is that if you look at our fluid trip study, looking at patterns of practice over the last, between SAFE and CHEST, there's been a huge swing away from colloids and a huge swing away from saline.
Yes.
Based on what I would call intermediate level data, and I would also say the opinions of people who make a lot of noise.
Yes.
And perhaps the influence of marketing.
Yeah.
So already there's been a clinical shift in use. I would suspect that Vanderbilt trials will add to that change in practice. I think the Vanderbilt trials now add a lot more fidelity to that opinion. I don't believe it's the final word. So I would tell people to consider that practice carefully and wait until the publication of the PLUS and the basic studies. This is a brief comment. We excluded patients with bone injury from our study. Because of our concerns of hypertonicity.
Yeah, and that's a genuine concern.
But the basic study in Brazil is including patients with TBI.
Okay, so that will be
informative. So that question will be answered as well. That in fact may add some more insight into the relative impact of hypertonicity on brain injury.
Yeah.
So look, at the fluid space, to use a pun, lots happening. I mean, over the last decade, going to your meetings, we've seen the whole thing change enormously. And I think we should just be happy and excited that very good people are doing very good research around the world on an annual basis, and it's a fascinating area.
So just to inform you, John, I showed you we did a formal poll. In other words, we posted one, and we had about 125, 130 votes about is the saline versus balance question dead, and I'll share the results of that in a second. But we also had, during the colloid crystalloid one, at the end, there was a hand vote in the room, and the room was pretty packed, a few hundred people in there, and there were very few hands went up that they were still using colloids. Now, I'm suspicious there are actually a lot more people in the room who do, but it's become a bit embarrassing to admit to it in public. It was a bit like around the time of the Cochrane meta-analysis, no one would admit to ever giving a patient albumin, which we know is not true. Pretty much everyone has. Yeah. But that's quite an interesting change in culture, at least, and your survey would suggest in practice. The result of the poll was that 59% of people thought that the saline versus balance question had been dealt with, but that's quite a Brexit vote. You know, that means overall 41% were a no or a maybe. So it seems as though the the voters there believe that the trials are, still need doing. There are still unanswered questions. So congratulations on your endeavours. Keep going, keep at it, John, and everyone who's doing it. And we'll debate this further. We always look forward to it. We thought these things were going to be over a long time ago, but I'm sure we'll be retiring with the debates ongoing. Now, John, Henley, tell us a little bit about Henley, just very briefly in closing. That a lot of people, we have listeners in 90 countries around the world, from Australia to Zimbabwe, so we sometimes talk about things that people haven't got a clue what we're talking about. What goes on at Henley?
Oh, okay, well, Henley is one of the oldest rowing regattas in the world. It's very prestigious. It was the start of the first Oxford-Cambridge boat race, in fact. Down the Henley Reach, and it's become a mecca for rowers to go and race. I was lucky to row there in 3 campaigns and to actually win a race there, win an event there many years ago. But it is an extraordinarily exciting place to go. It is a Georgian regatta. The technology is still very much based on the whole Georgian culture. People dress up in their finery, the big box of Pimm's and champagne, but all that sort of sideshow aside, some of the hardest racing done on the track. And I was extraordinary. So you go to the Henley Regatta website and you can see all the races on YouTube. Have a look at the St Paul's race, the Princess Elizabeth. Have a look at the men's and women's 8 and the single sculls. And if that doesn't whet your appetite to go Henley one year on your bucket list, then nothing more.
Quintessentially English. And I was lucky enough to go out there with you for a little bit of a sit around and watch some races. And we found a big silver cup there, as you say, with Myburgh J on it. So well done, John. John Myburgh. Thank you.
You're welcome, Monty.
Nick Majerison here. Thanks for listening to Top Med Talk. Now, before we let you go, it's important that we remind you to subscribe to Top Med Talk. That way you'll never, ever miss another episode. Also, if we could encourage you to join us on social media, Twitter, Facebook, LinkedIn, YouTube, pretty much every single social media platform, we're there. Join us. And finally, check out TopMedTalk.com. If you go to our website, you can subscribe to email updates. That way we can always tell you where we're going to be, what we're going to be doing, and how you can join us. TopMedTalk.com and click on the section marked email updates. Finally, Top Med Talk is proud to act as the broadcasting arm of EBPOM, Evidence-Based Perioperative Medicine. We'd love you to find out more about them as well. ebpom.org is their website. That's ebpom.org. And if you go to ebpom.org/meetings, you can find out about some of the wonderful meetings that we attend and cover across the year here on Top Med Talk. That's ebpom.org/meetings.